Welcome to this webinar on navigating the path to diversity in hiring. And this is a step-by-step plan to achieving a diverse and inclusive hiring program. And the reason why we frame it that way is we want to make sure everything we talk about is actionable and has a path to conclusion, that has an impact with what you can do right now to add diversity to create a more inclusive hiring process. And why do we want to do that? Well, we all know diversity and inclusion is good for business. We know this. That's why we're here in webinars like this, talking about how we can be more diverse and inclusive. It's just good for business. So why isn't hiring more diverse and inclusive? If we know that it drives the bottom line, we know that it increases revenue and profitability, and it decreases risk and attrition, why are so many hiring programs across so many organizations not inclusive? And there are some things that we're doing. There are some things that many organizations are doing to help solve this problem, such as training for more awareness, for more sensitivity, affirmative action plans to give some sort of goalposts on what diversity should look like. There's even companies out there that have designated positions that are designed for specific types of demographics, like people with disabilities or veterans. And those are great first steps. But they are addressing the symptoms, not solving the underlying problems, not creating more inclusive hiring programs so that everyone is treated the same way, treated fairly. To solve this problem, we have to shift the way that we think. We need to shift from this mindset of we need more, whatever your demographic target is around here, to something that's much more inclusive. We need a fair and consistent hiring process so that everybody who is qualified for the job can equally compete to show that they are the best for the position. So how do we do that? Well, there's a lot we can do to achieve that sort of goal. And we're going to take a look at a few of the main areas around the hiring process and go through them step by step. Everything we're going to talk about is going to be actionable. It's going to be adoptable by any organization. And it's going to be effective to make a real difference. The key here is not to eat the whole elephant in one bite, turn your ship on a dime, or whatever your analogy of choice or metaphor of choice is. It's to come up with what steps are going to work best for your organization or for your clients if you work with organizations that hire, to help move towards this path and walk down this path to more diversity and an inclusive hiring program. And to help us with the rest of this conversation, we're going to bring in an example. Our sales rep. Almost every organization out there is going to hire some form of sales in some point. So it's a good universal example of someone that needs to be hired. So we'll bring our sales rep hire throughout the conversation to give a little bit of color to the conversation, to what we're talking about, starting with defining the job. We have a whole conversation, a whole talk just on job requirements and defining the job, but we're going to do an abridged version with a focus on that diversity and inclusion angle in this talk. And for all job descriptions, there's a few things that are universal. The description must be clear. Your candidates need to know what the job is all about. It has to be descriptive. And that doesn't mean lots and lots of words. It doesn't mean colorful words. It doesn't mean full of jargon. It means that the candidate can read through and understand what the role is, what their responsibilities are, and most importantly, why they want it. And it must be deliberate, not painting that rosy picture of what you think the candidates might want to see, but what the candidates need to know. real. And all of this needs to be tied together by real requirements, predefined must-have requirements that have something behind them so that you know if candidates have actually met those requirements. And we'll go into more detail in all of this. But let's start with the title. Specifically with titles, the language needs to be common. There might be lots of guru and magician and ninja and whatever else positions out there. Level 3A, 2. But if you don't use language that your candidates will understand, that's more universal, you might start alienating them before they even click the apply button. So if you've got really interesting personality to your titles, great, put them in the subtext, not in the title, so you can draw your candidates in. And avoid biasing language. So what do I mean by biasing language? So these are actual descriptions and job titles that we find when we look for sales. Remember our sales rep example? Sales ninja, sales magician, salesman, junior sales rep, even something that goes as far as describing aggressive or fearless. So really, what's wrong with that? Well, sales ninja, sales magician, those talk to very specific types of personalities. So what if you have great sales candidates that don't really identify as ninjas, that are not into ninja movies or not very violent? They might be turned off by a position title like that. Salesman, well, should go without saying, and yet we still see it. The word man is in the title. So what about women? And then something like a junior sales rep, which is designed to describe a level, an entry level, but it doesn't. It's actually an age reference. What about a mid-career shifter, someone coming out of the military who's in their 30s or 40s and looking to start a career in sales? What's the likelihood of them clicking on something that says junior? So just take a quick look at the language that's used for the job descriptions, for the job titles. And make sure there isn't something that's talking to very specific personalities or interests or gender or age, and pull those out. You don't need them. So what about summary? Same tips. Use common language and avoid biasing language. It should go without saying, but I'm sure everyone on this webinar has seen summaries that are just awful. And so we picked out a few. So imagine a job summary for our sales rep. Looking for a go-getter sales ninja that can tackle our digital program and take down our competition. Wow. So there's a few things wrong with this. First of all, it doesn't actually say what the job is going to do. Salespeople sell. So other than something around a digital program, this isn't telling the candidates anything, but it's also doing it super aggressively. So it's only going to resonate with certain personality types that are very aggressive: ninja, tackle, takedown. And from a biasing standpoint, from a diversity standpoint, it is narrowing that pool of candidates that would be interested. So this could be deliberate. This particular organization could want extremely aggressive personalities. But if that is not the intention, this is a really bad job summary. So what about something a little bit more descriptive? Our sales reps engage with customers through phone, email, and chat, are extremely responsive, and consistently get some of the highest satisfaction scores in the industry. Okay, this still doesn't quite talk about what the sales rep is selling. However, it does say how, so it does give methodology: phone, email, chat, and it also describes what success is and what the organization values. Much, much more broad. and much more resonating to the type of individual that's going to thrive in the environment. They're looking for responsive people who are comfortable with communication, phone, email, chat, and get high satisfaction scores. They care about the way that they interact with those prospects and those customers. So that's pretty good. And it's going to draw in the type of talent based on how they like to communicate and what they value, not how aggressive their personality is. And then let's take it one step further. Looking for an account manager who is passionate about making an impact on the environment and business through solar technologies. You don't need to be a solar expert. You bring the passion, we bring the training. Now, this one is interesting. It tells the candidates what's being sold with the solar technologies, but it gets to the mission of the company, the core values that are driving that individual. Impact on environment and business. And as an added bonus, it's also talking about the level of training. To thrive in this environment, they need the passion, they need that interest, but they don't need to be an expert. Training is involved, which is also a bonus because now the organization is also describing that they're going to provide training, they're going to provide value to these candidates, which is a great summary for drawing in a range of talent that's interested in solar, that's interested in environment or in business, but also is interested in growing as an individual without any of that aggressive language. So one of the most impactful parts of a description when it comes to diversity, when it comes to being inclusive, is the culture. Mostly because so much of the time, culture is not done correctly. It's focused on the wrong elements. Culture is mission, value, and experience. It is not parties. It is not personality. It's also one of the most common excuses that are used to discriminate against individuals and promote biased hiring practices. So the better the culture statement in the job description, the better the culture statement that can anchor the conversation, the less opportunity hiring teams have to use the culture excuse. And that's critical for removing bias from the hiring process and promoting diversity and an inclusive program. So what is a good culture statement? It's easier to start with what culture is not. Culture is not personality. It is not a beer test. I want to go get a beer with you. It is not, do I like you? That's great for finding friends or spouses or significant others. It is horrible for finding teammates. It's also not an ideal version of the truth. You need to attract the right type of candidates to the job. So describing what you want the organization to be, what the organization wants to be or thinks it should be, rather than what it is just going to cause an attrition problem. Because the people who are attracted to that are going to get buyer's remorse. And there's a very easy way to test this. If the culture you're describing you don't believe, or if you're an external recruiter, if the culture you're describing, your clients, your hiring manager doesn't really believe it, says it with a chuckle, it's not really the culture. And cultures are not picnics, parties, and ping pong tables. It's not a bunch of whats. It's what's behind those whats. And when you use a bunch of whats like picnics, parties, and ping pong tables, you might end up alienating individuals, creating a less inclusive conversation. Because what if you have individuals who have obligations outside of work and they can't stay after and go to parties, or they don't like ping pong? So if that's what culture is not, what is it? Mission, value, experience. From a mission standpoint, why does the organization exist? What is that one reason, that one thing that everyone in the company, independent of role, is there to achieve? It should be simple, concise, and it should be compelling, exciting. You should make people feel proud that they are coming to work every day to achieve that mission. Values are the behaviors that drive decisions. From the C-suite down to the most recent individual contributor, what is driving everyone's decisions? For example, and I have seen this, I've heard values of, we're very family oriented. We value families among those who work here. Except that organization was really bad at giving time off and always asked for nights and weekends of their employees. So was that really a value? Was family a value if what they're looking for from their employees is to leave their family all the time? No, it's not a driver of decisions. So what are those values that truly drove the decisions in the company? And then the organization experience. How do we behave day to day? What is the experience going to be like for the candidate for real as they walk in? And it's got to be universal and visible and celebrated. In very simple terms, it's not if a company has a ping pong table, it's what the company does with that ping pong table. That's the experience. So why is this all so important from a diversity and inclusion perspective? It all comes back down to that culture excuse. And I'm sure everyone on this call has heard it before. Well, this applicant is just not a good fit. I feel like they're not a good culture fit. Right? But why? Why are they not a good fit? If the hiring team cannot clearly articulate why a candidate is not a good fit and tie it back to the mission, the values, and the organization experience that is the culture statement, it's not a valid reason. It is an excuse, and it is a very dangerous excuse when it comes to inclusion. So it's really important to spend some time to understand the culture, especially if it's a company, if it's an organization that uses the excuse of, just not a good fit. And then finally, from defining a job are the requirements, are the things that the candidates need to be able to do, to know, to have in order to be qualified for the job. These must be clear and actionable. They must be realistic, measurable, defendable, and must have. And what do I mean by all of that? From a clarity perspective, if a reader can look at it and describe the job back to you, describe those requirements back to you, they're clear. But if they can't, it might not be clear enough. It might have too much jargon. A good test for this is find somebody to read through it who might have a very similar job but in a different industry. Because if they can't connect all of the dots, it might not be clear enough. Measurable. How do you know if they meet the requirement? If the answer is yes or no, or where on a scale, or whatever the type of requirement is. If you can't clearly articulate that how somebody can meet the requirement or how you're going to prove that your candidate meets the requirements, it's not measurable. Realistic. There are so many articles out there, so many conversations around purple squirrels or unicorns or whatever else you want to call them. It's so prevalent that we have terms like unicorns and purple squirrels, where the requirements are just not realistic. So there's a very easy check for this. Look around the organization or similar organizations at the same or comparable role. Do the individuals that fill those roles meet all the requirements? Because if they don't, it's probably not a realistic list. And make sure you're looking on comparable level and compensation as well. So if you find someone who meets all the requirements and they're getting paid double the amount, still have a problem. Defendable and must have are absolutely critical, not only from a diversity and inclusion perspective, but also from a compliance perspective. If it's not defendable, if you can't easily explain why this is a must-have requirement, the applicant cannot do the job without the requirement, then it's going to leave the organization open for liability, especially if it affects one demographic group more than another. And even if it is defendable, if it's not truly a must-have, where the individual won't be successful without it, then it is pinching the candidate pool, which especially now with such a low unemployment rate, the last thing you want to do is unnecessarily pinch the candidate pool. So make sure it truly is a required. There's a lot more depth to this. We're going to go into more detail later, a little later in this conversation, and go through an example. But first, let's talk about sourcing. So you define the job, you've got a great description, you spent some time to make sure that there is no biasing language in the title, that your culture is a true culture statement, that your requirements are really must-have and they're not filled with jargon. So now you're ready to go out there and grab those candidates. So where do you source them from? So for the active candidates, there's always the common job boards. I'm sure most of us live and breathe on those common job boards. The problem with the common job boards is the demographic distribution. So we've got some data that shows that common job boards, they're the big names, the ones that are out there that everyone uses, they tend to be far more white, 2/3 to 3/4 white in terms of the applicants that come in. They also have extremely low rates of veterans and people with disabilities who at least self-identify. So about 5%, which is much lower than the actual number of, from the candidate pool, which means that there are a lot of candidates out there that are not going to the common job boards, and it's affecting some demographic groups more than others. So if you're looking to build a more diverse and inclusive hiring program, you have to fill the funnel with a more diverse candidate pool. So going beyond the common job boards to find active candidates can be really important. And there are solutions out there. There are specialty job boards that focus on one or more demographics or interest groups. Universities and colleges all seem to have their own version of job boards and student affair programs. And there's a huge amount of diversity that goes through different universities. There's also advocacy organizations. So if you are targeting specific demographics, or you're looking to have a mix that's a lot closer to the demographic distribution of the local community, you can go to different organizations and ask them where to go to find candidates. And then, of course, community outreach, that whole saying of go out to where the candidates are, whatever that means for your community. From a passive standpoint, those candidates that you're going out and actively courting to come in and apply for your jobs rather than the ones that are just randomly hitting that apply button. It's all about where you're looking. A lot of organizations have preferential organizations that they look at. So throwing out a completely random example, let's say you're a high-tech company and you love hiring people from Microsoft. That's great. Maybe you have some experience where you have a bulk of your engineers, or you have a few ex-Microsoft people, they're fantastic, you want more. Now, the thing to keep in mind with that is if you're focusing on a few organizations that you really like to pull candidates from, that you like to go after, you are inheriting their demographic distribution. So if, let's say, you go after a company that is notorious for not having very many women in their technology areas, or you're going after a company that doesn't have an inclusive program for people with disabilities, that is the candidate pool you're pulling from. So just be aware of those target organizations, or whatever your target universities, or whatever that target is, and know what you're inheriting from that. Another thing to think about is what those skills and experiences are. Too narrow with the type of experiences that you want, you might also be inheriting a certain demographic pool. And I'll give you an example there. So I've spoke to one company that does trucking, and they have certain skills that they really like in terms of trucking. One of the skills that they do not like, or that they tend not to go for, is hiring drivers of buses. So they like the drivers of big rigs, not of buses. But most of the female drivers, the women drivers, start with buses. So they are inadvertently pinching their candidate pool to side to more men than women. So when you're looking at the type of skills that you want, what's transferable, what's comparable, just know that there might be a demographic consequence to that. Along the same veins is potential versus box checking, very, very similar. Somebody who might not have had that exact experience, but because of the potential and other experiences that they've had, they can get in there and they can be successful and thrive. This is important with any industry or skill that tends to have a problem with diversity to begin with. So if you find very few people who are of a certain type in a profession, and you're looking only for those with the exact experience, guess what? Right? If you're looking at engineers that tend to be only men, and you only want people with that certain experience, you're going to probably get only men. The mirror effect, this one is more general. Don't look for people like you, is essentially what it means. Hiring managers are most comfortable, usually, with people who have similar backgrounds and experiences to themselves or others on the team. So that will have that mirroring effect where everyone on the team will look the same. So we're going to try to break that as much as possible and get a sense of what's a real must-have versus that comfort zone. And then finally, title inflation. So this one is not talked about too often, but it's a really big issue when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Women tend to get promoted less often than men. People of color tend to get promoted less often than white people. So if you are looking for only people with a vice president level or above, director or above, you are starting to inherit that problem. So it goes back to potential versus box checking. Make sure that the title actually means what you need it to mean. And if at all possible, don't have title requirements. Look for the experience, the skill set, the potential instead. So it's not inheriting those problems. Qualifying candidates. Okay, so you've sourced them well, you have a great job description. You're now looking at a variety of active and passive sources to pull those candidates in. Now you need to figure out which ones are actually worth the time of the hiring team. So what we recommend is to create a consistent process, as consistent as absolutely possible, because then everyone is qualified fairly against the same criteria in the same way. And if you organize it right, then you can respect everyone's time, the hiring team's time, your time, the candidate's time, so that it's the most efficient process possible. So you want to start with the high-level must-haves. Do they meet the minimum? Get rid of all of the noise. Those individuals that there's just no way they're going to be able to do the job, they're just not qualified. Then you can move into something like the soft skills or traits. Do they have those soft skills that are required to be successful in the job and in the organization? We highly recommend using assessments for this. I don't know about you, but I've absolutely never heard anyone who's applied for a job during an interview go, I'm not very dependable. You cannot rely on me at all to show up on time. They're pretty bad at self-identifying. So at this point, you might want to measure that. Then something that gets a little deeper. Fit for tasks. Are they able to achieve the goals and do the tasks of the job? And then finally, are they a good culture fit, a good culture add? Remember the culture the way that it is, not the culture of, are you going to be a good friend, or that culture excuse? And then that's how you can get to your qualified candidates that are worth everybody's time to bring in for those interviews and select the final one. So remember when we talked about how we would come back to the requirements? Here they are again. And let's take an example. So now you've got some candidates, you've got your requirements. Do they meet all of these? So for our sales rep, must have a 4-year degree in sales, marketing, or equivalent. Super common. This requirement is all over the place. And it's clear, it's absolutely clear. I know exactly what this is, and it's measurable. I can call the university or the college that they've gone to see if they actually graduated with that degree. So it's completely measurable. And it is realistic. There are a lot of people with degrees out there. Is it defendable? Do you really need that degree to be successful? What if you have 10 years or 5 years or 3 years of sales experience and you're always meeting and beating your numbers? You're really compelling on the phone. Your customers love you. Is it really defendable to have that degree or to require that degree? And if it's not defendable, is it really a must-have? Perhaps not. What about a requirement like this? Comfortable cold calling for your sales rep. They're going to have to do a lot of cold calling. You want to be able to do that. Is it clear? Yes. As long as they know what a cold calling is, we might need to add a little language there to explain what a cold call is. But for the most part, it's clear. Is it measurable? Yes. You come up with the right types of questions, and we'll get to that in a minute. You can measure if somebody is comfortable or knows how to cold call. It's absolutely realistic. It is defendable. It is a core requirement, a core part of the job. You're coming on the job, you're going to be doing a lot of cold calling. You've got to be comfortable being able to do that. And therefore, it is a must-have. So going through each requirement, quick checklist to make sure it meets all these needs. And if it does the candidate meet it? So then moving down that funnel into the soft skills. We have an entire webinar just on this. In fact, it is next week. We're going to be doing a webinar on this on selecting assessments and understanding assessments in order to properly measure soft skills. So if you're interested in that, just contact us, let us know. But for the most part, at a very high level, you want to make sure whatever assessments you're using or methodology you're using to measure soft skills and soft traits, it has to be predictive, which means that what you're measuring matters to the success of the job, right? You can measure all sorts of things for candidates, but if it doesn't actually matter to if they're going to be successful in the job, then it's not a good assessment, or it's not a good step. For instance, you can measure someone's height, but that could have nothing to do if they're good at designing code. Is it accurate? There is a lot of assessments out there that make claims that are not totally true. They cannot support them. So when you're selecting a provider or you're creating assessments, you've got to make sure it is actually measuring what it says it's measuring and it's provable. Otherwise, you're opening the organization up to liability. Is it fair? That has everything to do with, is it measuring everyone on a level playing field, not giving any or group an unfair advantage over another group. It's called adverse impact, and it is a measurement for any assessment. You can always ask about that. And is it accessible? So from the standpoint of biases and being inclusive, this one is really important. And this can mean anything from people with disabilities. Can someone physically get to the location of the assessment, whether it's in a physical location or a digital one? Can they actually take the assessment or not? At least those who can be qualified for the position, can they actually take the assessment or not? It can also be a socioeconomic bias. Is there a cost associated with it? So these are all things to look at when looking at how you're going to use soft skills. Fit for tasks. Measuring if someone can actually perform the job or not. Any types of questions that you use for that fit for tasks, these scenario type of questions, they must be clear. The applicant needs to understand what you're asking. They must be measurable. You need to know, the team needs to know what a good answer versus a bad answer is. Is it a yes, no? Is it on a scale? Predefine what good versus bad is and how it's going to be measured. And of course, it must be applicable. Everything must be applicable to success on the job. So for example, if you're talking about, remember that cold calling ability that we were talking about in that first requirement? How do we measure that? Well, we can ask a question. How do you conduct a cold call? Okay, is that clear? No. Are you asking, how do I dial a phone or look up a number? Are you asking what I say? Are you asking about how I write scripts? It's not that clear. It's very open-ended, which makes it super hard to measure because your candidates can take this in so many different directions, it's going to be hard to compare them. It is applicable, because we already talked about that. Cold calling is applicable, but it's got to also be a question that's clear and measurable. So what about something more like this? A prospect says, your product sounds great, but that's not a priority. How do you respond? Okay, now this is clear. It's super clear what the candidate's being asked. They're given a scenario of what a prospect is saying over phone or in person, and they now have to respond, and their responsibility is to tell you what that response is. And if you give it a little thought beforehand, it is absolutely measurable. You can define what traits, what things you're looking for in a good answer versus what's in a bad answer, and then you can rate them. And of course, it's applicable. So coming up with questions where you're going to get the type of response that you need in order to evaluate if someone has the skill that you're measuring, and you have a sense of what it is you're measuring and how you're going to measure it. And then finally, those fit for culture, mission, value, experience. How do you ask questions for this? It also has to be measurable and applicable, but this one needs to be insightful, because a lot of times what ends up happening is questions are being asked where the candidate gets a sense of what you want to hear versus what you need to hear. So for example, culture is, don't forget, mission, value, experience. It is not, I like you. So for example, if you ask a question like, how do you get along with people? Because you have a value of no jerks allowed, and we actually have come across a company, no jerks allowed. They like people who get along with everyone and really value the interpersonal experience. Asking a question like, how do you get along with people? How is anyone going to answer that? No one's going to tell you, well, I'm a jerk, so I really don't get along with anyone. I don't like people. This is a question where clearly the candidate knows what you're looking for. So it's not insightful, and therefore it's not measurable. Everyone's going to answer relatively the same. It is applicable. But think about a question more like this. Tell me about a time where something funny happened within a professional setting. Okay, that's more interesting. Because what are they telling you? Are they laughing at somebody at work where something happened that they thought was funny to someone? Are they laughing with people? Is it a joke that they have on their own? Is it a joke that they share? What happened because of the joke? You can see a lot of tendencies from a question like that, from bully personality traits to team traits to just being kind of all on their own. And it's insightful because they don't see where you might be going with this. They don't necessarily see what you're measuring. And it could be measurable because you could look for things like, I want to see someone who likes to laugh with others and use that as a bonding experience. And of course, it's applicable. For the selection process itself, once you know what you want, how you want to qualify the candidates, the best method is to make it as anonymous as possible. The more you can move through these steps without getting distracted or without allowing the team to get distracted by any other information that is impertinent, the less chance that bias is going to come in. So if you're looking at minimum requirements and you have no idea, for example, if a candidate has gone to a university or gone to university or not, if it's not a requirement, now you're not going to have the bias of, well, people who've gone to university will probably be better, because you don't know. So it's not distracting. So the more that the candidates can be anonymous, the better. And the reasons are simple. It enforces compliance. It reduces bias because you're not being distracted. It promotes objective decisions. Everyone has to be evaluated the same way by the same criteria. There isn't anything else in there, which then allows for true comparisons and also allows you to avoid the mirror effect or the beer test. You don't have enough information to know if this person is exactly like you or not. You're forced to focus on the pieces that matter. So pulling as much as you can out of the process that is not defined as necessary, the better. And that's it. You get to the finish line. A couple little bonus tips here with the offer. When you get to the offer, is keep in mind another big area for a gap is around salary. So women tend to make less money than men for comparable job title and responsibilities. The same thing with people of color against white. So when you're doing the salary check, or when you're doing the salary conversations, the negotiations, if you can preset a band, even if it's just for this job, that this is the range that you want to be in, then you're making sure everyone is coming in with a fair amount, especially if you set it before you look at your first candidate, so you don't know what your candidate is. Then there's no way for anyone to challenge you that you're being discriminatory or unfair. Other things that can be really, really helpful when you're getting into the negotiation and offer is document all your benefits up front, including things that people tend not to ask about that can be biasing, such as maternity leave or medical coverage, and have that available to every candidate at the very beginning. The more you're disclosing up front, they can then look in for their own personal interests without ever disclosing something that they're not comfortable disclosing. And just to save a little bit of time for everybody involved, do some sort of salary check at the beginning of the process. So you don't need to tell your candidates exactly what you want to pay. Your candidates don't need to necessarily tell you exactly what they intend to make, but some way that you can either anonymously or not do a check to make sure that you're in the right range. So that way you're not getting all the way to the end after weeks just to find out you can't afford that candidate can't afford you. And that's it. Those are some hints and tips across the hiring process to increase diversity and inclusion in hiring. We actually have quite a bit more content. So including things like these slides, we've got some white papers on things like the job descriptions and selecting assessments. We do a lot of webinars, and we publish weekly tips that are one thing that anyone and everyone in any organization can do to become more inclusive in their hiring programs. So we absolutely invite and welcome you to take a look at any of these topics and more. And if you have any questions or requests, please don't hesitate to contact us.